Hey guys, so right now it's about 5 o'clock in the evening on Wednesday. I don't even know what day it is anymore. On Wednesday, we're still on baby watch, so I'm planning on the possibility of being gone tomorrow during U.S. history, and that is why I made this video for you, so you could still review. So I'm hanging out on the deck of my parents' house, and you might hear my phone go off, you might hear the dog bark, but I'm still going to try and give you a full review for this so that you are comfortable coming into your benchmark on Friday. Okay, if you need anything from me at all during the day on Thursday, I'm only planning on taking half a day, so I should be back in the afternoon. If you need anything, come find me at 4th Hour Prep. I'll be around during all 3 lunches. And then also I'll be after school for something from some of my freshmen. So I'll be after school on Thursday too. You can email me, whatever. I'm just going to be probably sitting in a hospital. So you can let me know if you need anything at all, okay? Let me just arrange my screen here. Alright, so I've got the review guide out in front of me, and you at this point should have that done. So I'm going to... Oh, and there goes my phone. It's nothing important. Good. Okay. We are going to talk about some of the big concepts that are on your benchmark. I'm going to run you through some answers on this, and then you should be set from there. Okay, so the first question is, what is the name of the invisible border between the communist nations of Eastern Europe and the democracies of Western Europe? And that is the Iron Curtain. When we talked about that, we said that it's not an actual, like, physical Iron Curtain, right? One of the questions on one of your tests was about the construction of the Iron Curtain. We didn't build a curtain made out of iron. It's just, it's the name we give to the idea of having, like, a strong barrier to keep communism contained. It's the containment policy. You want communism contained over in the East so that it can't affect the democracies of Western Europe. Remember, this is a little tricky because the city of Berlin is entirely within Eastern Germany, but half of the city of Berlin is free and democratic. So that causes a little bit of issue. So you have the Marshall Plan and you have the Truman Doctrine. And the big point there that you want to know is that they were aimed at containing communism. One focused on rebuilding Europe after the war, and the other was really more of the communist idea. But in general, the two of them were to stop the spread of communism into the West. Greece and Turkey relate to the Truman Doctrine because of the containment policy, okay? So if Greece and Turkey fall to communism, there's it's dangerous for the rest of the Western countries. So they're kind of like buffer nations that we use to keep communism on the eastern side of. Okay, so the purpose of NATO, number 4, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that is, again, that's a containment policy. You have all these countries that are banding together to stop the spread of communism, and the opposite of that would then be the Warsaw Pact. Remember that the idea of NATO is that if one country is attacked, if one country that's part of NATO is attacked by a communist country, then all the countries, the sun is getting bright, then all the countries have to go to war to protect them. So being part of NATO is a big deal, because if you get attacked by a communist country, you now have the backing of all the other countries that are in NATO. And eventually Western Germany and West Berlin, as part of that, would be allowed to join NATO, which is extremely dangerous because that just destroys all hopes of reunifying the country. All those hopes are dashed, and that increases tensions between the East and the West, and between communism and freedom. Let me go to the next question here. Okay, number 5 asks that how did the Soviets' view differ from what should be done from Western nations? And that's my brother. I'm so sorry for the drama here. Ah! It's about Netflix. It's not even important. Okay, so the big thing at Potsdam is that the Soviets want to make Germany pay. They want Germany to pay for what's happened. They want them to pay economically, and in the future they want there to be sanctions and all kinds of things to force them to pay for the the disaster of the war, and the West is more focused on moving forward. They want to give countries aid and help them progress, because a strong world economy or a strong German economy would make a strong world economy, and they want to do better coming out of war. But the Soviets are less interested in that and more interested in punishing Germany for their actions during World War II. The CIA comes into existence because we need a way to gather intelligence during peacetime. Previous to this, we had the military was our only way of gathering intelligence, and that was not a phenomenal system, because what do you do if you're not at war? How are you getting information in other countries? And so the CIA was born out of the Second World War. The Korean Peninsula during the Second World War, or after the Second World War rather, is divided at the 38th parallel. Remember, we intended to set up like a brand new government in there, but you're dealing with communists and the Chinese in the north and freedom in the south, and that leads to a long and very real war that doesn't really go anywhere or accomplish much of anything, except for a lot of lives end up being lost. It starts because the north invades the south, so that's the big thing, is that the north crosses the 38th parallel. They're the ones who kind of initiate the whole thing. Number 8, what brought the U.S. and the USSR close to nuclear war? We call this the Cold War because it never actually heats up, right? That's what we say. There's no real war that comes out of this at all. And so the closest we come is in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you did a reading on that and had some questions that went with it, and you did a timeline and like a map and some other things when we talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So basically the Soviets installed missiles into Cuba that would have the potential. They're very far-reaching. They could have reached all the way to Washington, D.C., and that, of course, makes bureaucrats nervous. And so we don't like that. And President JFK is able to kind of play this really democratically, and we end up ending it without any, well, too many shots being fired. The Cubans attacked us, but we never shot back. Number 9, the 22nd Amendment. If you remember, it's 2-2, which means 2 terms. So the 22nd Amendment is necessary because FDR is our Franklin Delano Pres for Life Roosevelt, right? He was elected to 4 separate terms. He's the only president to be elected to more than 4 terms. Not the only president to run to more than 2, but he's the only president elected to more than 2 terms. And after his 4th term, Republicans don't like the fact that FDR has been president for 4 straight terms. And so I'm recording a video for my students. How's my dad? Hi, Dad. And so they don't like the fact that a Democrat's been elected 4 straight times, and so we introduced the 22nd Amendment as a way of ensuring some turnover. Number 10, McCarthy. You remember this guy? He got up and he stood up and he said, "I have in my hand a list of 203 communists in the State Department," and everyone freaked out. We talked about this when we accused people of being secret Vikings, right? We planted clothing on them around the room and made them defend themselves. So McCarthy becomes famous because he starts this huge movement of fear of communism, and people are being accused left and right, and it ends up like getting in Hollywood, and we start producing movies and this kind of thing to in order to and there goes the dog because my dad's leaving, sorry. And so McCarthy just really, we call it McCarthyism. He starts this whole movement, just this fear during the Red Scare, this fear of communism. The GI Bill gets passed following World War II, and the bill, it did some great things. Remember, it helped returning veterans to be able to like buy houses and to start businesses and to go to school, and it did these things. Some of the extensions of that then are that we have the growth of the suburbs and additionally the Federal Highway Act. So highways are built to get people to the suburbs. Side note, you can get out of the city really quickly in case of nuclear explosion, but the main deal is that we can come to and from the city, we can live in the suburb and work in the city, and now we can afford a house and afford a car and all these other things because of the GI Bill. We also see a lot of people go back to school, so there's this huge influx into colleges, and colleges really kind of like shift and figure out how they're going to deal with this huge influx of numbers But as a whole, this trends American society upward. And we come into the 1950s. We talked about like the idea of the traditional family, and we talked about just this like prosperity and wealth and this consumer-driven culture where people are buying things. So the all comes out of the 1950s. So there is like 11 and 12 for you right there. Okay, so the Taft-Hartley Act, that's the thing that says that it's illegal to be in a union, or not. I'm making things up. You have to sign and say like, I'm not a communist, if you were the like head of a union, and the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. Okay, so the number 14, Truman desegregates the armed forces. Basically, it's part of the civil rights movement that claims that everybody is equal, everybody's the same, and the African American veterans weren't getting their military benefits, and so this was able to give them some of their benefits back by making them all one and the same. Johnson and the Great Society program. The big thing here is we were trying to stop poverty. We talked about that. We were trying to help with poverty, which is weird because during the New Deal we had a lot of similar programs, but there was like economic decline and people were starving, and this program came during a time of relative prosperity. We did talk about how there were different class levels during the 50s and how like the difference between the high and the low, the high life and the low life, and the poor were really poor. And so the Great Society programs were intended then to help people get out of poverty. It was aimed at eliminating poverty. All right, the court cases we talked about, Gideon versus Wainwright and Miranda versus Arizona, have to do with your rights on trial, with due process, with your right to a lawyer, with your right to have your rights read to you, with your right to remain silent, regardless of whether or not you know the law. So that's really what comes out of these two court cases, is due process. If you remember, I had you write down like 3 specific things on the article worksheet. Look those back up, okay? Those like 3 fill-in-the-blank questions. Go look at those. The information there is spot on for what you need. All right, Brown versus Ford and Plessy versus Ferguson. Which one comes first? I feel a little like Dora the Explorer. It's Plessy versus Ferguson, and that was train cars, not buses. Okay, so in Plessy versus Ferguson, what you see happening is a man who's 1/8 African American and 7/8 white attempts to board a train and get into a white passenger car, and he is denied access to that car, and there'll be sue, and it goes through this whole thing, and it ends up, we come up with the doctrine of separate but equal. So the Supreme Court at the time says that it's illegal to separate, to have separate things, as long as they're equal facilities. So you can't give, theoretically, you can't have like a super nice train car for white people and a crappy train car for everybody else. That's not the way it was supposed to work. We all know what history changes, though. So Brown versus Board of Education challenges this idea of separate but equal. This has to do with the kids who were trying to go to, has to do with kids trying to go to school and the desegregation of schools. And the Supreme Court would ultimately rule that separate but equal is inherently unequal, because equal means everybody the same, and so to even split up for any reason, not just race, but to split for any reason is inherently unequal because it's different, it's not the same. So effectively, Brown versus Board undoes what had happened in Plessy versus Ferguson. The Little Rock Nine were a group of students who tried to go to the all-white school. They'd been integrated into there. The governor, remember, he's like, okay, I don't want to deal with this fighting, whatever, drama, integration. We're not playing that game. And he calls in the National Guard. And the National Guard for the state of Arkansas stops these kids, these 9 kids, from going to school. Remember, this is a national law that we're integrating schools. And he's like, not having it. So things heat up. And just a few days later, the president says, you know what? You're not in charge. I am. And so the president... Eisenhower, he would assume control of the Arkansas National Guard because he's commander-in-chief. He assumes control of that state National Guard, and switches their instructions to, instead of preventing them from going to school, you're going to protect them so they can go to school. And they would end up being there all year. And there was still lots of drama, lots of violence and threats, but the National Guard spent the year protecting the Little Rock Nine so they could go to school. Okay, the bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, and the Selma March are 3 distinct events, and you guys struggle with this a little bit on your unit test, so follow with me, okay? The bus boycott is the first thing, okay? Really like the first successful part of the movement that gets it going. This happens right after Rosa Parks is arrested for being on the bus, okay? And so they decide, we're not going to ride buses anymore. And so they, like black taxi drivers, lower their fares to that of a bus fare, and they carpool, and they do all these things to avoid having to take buses. Martin Luther King Jr. gets arrested for conspiracy to interfere with business, and all this drama goes down. But eventually, a little over a year later, Montgomery would change their laws, and they would desegregate busing. So on the bus boycott, that had to do with where you could sit on a bus, and we end up changing that so you can sit anywhere you want. The Freedom Rides seek to integrate bus terminals, okay? So like where you can and can't be within an interstate terminal, going from one state to another. Okay, so these would start in the north and go south, and you would have black people, white people, men, women would all ride the whole way down and break the rules. And they are often, this is when we talk about the media being really helpful, because they were passive, they were non-violent, and the media documented some of the abuse they faced as they would get off buses and just get the crap beat out of them for riding a bus that legally they could ride, but the people in the South didn't appreciate them riding there. So that was the Freedom Rides. Often they were, the police commissioner and his friends were a big part of the, they were supposed to protect the buses, but they would stop outside the city limits and then let the people get destroyed. The third thing, the Selma March, that's voting. That's when they marched from Selma on in. They started in Selma because only 3% of the population was registered to vote. So they marched in. They tried 3 times across the bridge. The first time, they just kind of had to, they got beat up really bad. They were told to turn around, and they just knelt down, and they were beat for that. The second time, they got too afraid, and they turned around and went back. And the third time, they were finally able to successfully cross the bridge. We come into our big "I Have a Dream" speech, and eventually the Voting Rights Act would be passed shortly after that. We have 3 acronymed groups we're looking at. The SCLC is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that is Martin Luther King's group of pastors from the South that joined together. They gave birth to other groups like the Montgomery Improvement Association, who was responsible for the bus boycott. They gave birth to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Those are the people with Ella Josephine Baker, who organized sit-ins and more nonviolent protests by students. Just like the Freedom Rides had been young people, here students again are banding together and changing policy. And I told you we'd talk more about that coming into Vietnam and some more things, talking about student-led protests. The NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that's just like a civil rights activist group. Thurgood Marshall was a lawyer for them, and he would eventually serve on the Supreme Court, but he's the lawyer who represented for Brown versus Board. And then the Nation of Islam, that's your black extremist group, okay? So they don't necessarily believe in violence unprovoked, but they believe in protecting or defending yourself when attacked. Their leader was Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm X was associated with that group. They believed in complete separation, okay? So they believed in basically like 2 coexisting societies, a white society and a black society, whereas Martin Luther King's group believed in integration. Nation of Islam just wanted to be completely separate. Malcolm X would eventually leave that group and become part of, well, not really part of King's movement, but he would leave the Nation of Islam group. Okay, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 19 65 do two very different things. But important to know is that the Voting Rights Act, what it adds to the Civil Rights Act is it adds election monitors, so we can send people to monitor elections. I already talked about Malcolm X. Cesar Chavez, we talked about him. That was the grapes guy, the immigrant. We did a little like reading on him and answered some questions. So he was the immigrant who was fighting for equal rights. He did hunger strikes and more nonviolent protests. And you have a little note on him too. I can't write off the top of my head remember what that little note is, but I told you to like write a couple things down, special on that sheet. So go pull that out and look at it. Otherwise, you'll get them wrong. Okay, go look at them. Okay, I'm starting to lose my voice. 24 and 25 have to do with the women's right movement that we just kind of wrapped up at the beginning of this week. So the goals of now, we know that they were big on pushing education for all women. Okay, we want to educate women, we want to help them in school and this kind of thing. And we know that a big problem they had was that they alienated women who wanted to stay at home. So these women who wanted to stay at home and wanted to be mothers or housewives were really looked down on, and they were kind of looked at as like women as other or subpar because they didn't want to do the big business high life. Remember I showed you that commercial from the 1970s or the 1980s where the woman's dancing around with the perfume. She can go to work and, you know, bring home the bacon and still come home and not let you forget you're a man. So it's perpetuating this image of I can be a working woman and still be feminine at the same time. The Equal Rights Amendment was not added to the Constitution. We've been over this and over this because it didn't get enough votes. Plain and simple. It didn't get ratified. Not enough states passed it. That's that. Alright, if you give me a second here, I'm going to pull open the benchmark exam, and I'm going to make sure that I didn't miss anything huge for you that you want to be aware of. I'm going to slide this back over here so I can see myself. Patience, please. Thank you for working with me. I know this is unconventional and a little bit strange, but I wanted to make sure you still got this review from me. It is definitely not quarter one. It is quarter three. I wanted to make sure you got this review from me directly, so that it was so that everything's copacetic here. Okay, hang on one second. Let's take care of this. Alright. Oh, goodness. I'm struggling, folks. You can make fun of me on Friday. Alright. I just gotta read through these and make sure that we talked about them. Specifically, okay, I think I kind of blew past this. I'm like looking at the clock, realizing I've only been talking for 23 minutes, so I'm sure I was spitting information, and I'm sorry. The main purpose of the Marshall Plan is to help the economies, and the main purpose of the Truman Plan, that's more focused on containing communism. They're both focused on maintaining communism, but the Marshall Plan is different because its big thing is to help them recover. Remember, we watched the crash course on that, and they talked about like cars and buildings and this kind of thing. So we were trying to help them kind of like rebuild their infrastructure after the war. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think we talked about most of this. Remember with McCarthyism that he just like made wild accusations, they were all unfounded. So he starts this whole movement, this whole fear of communism with like no background, nothing to base it on. He's just baseless accusations, and yes. Just remember Taft-Hartley has to do with labor unions. That's a huge one. yeah, guys, I think you're gonna be okay. If you, like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. Look back over, like, your notes and the Quizlets, and especially your review guide. Your review guide is pretty much like, it's pretty direct, okay? It's pretty direct here, so that's good for you. And like I said, if you have questions, you can totally let me know, and I'll be right there to help you. I'm just like sitting at a hospital, so I can totally respond to emails, or anything like that, okay? So I will be here before school tomorrow, and I'll be here at 4th hour today. So just feel free to check in and let me know what you need, okay? Alrighty, guys. We'll see ya.